Yeah, so before we all start off, everybody a big smile, big thumbs up, and how many of you ever used your brakes in the corner and are here to talk about it today? Absolutely, every one of us. Turns out that we brake into corners naturally. I'm going to define what trail braking is. If you go into the corner and then you go for the brakes because you miscalculated the corner, that is called oh shit braking. That is not trail braking. If you're dragging your rear brake into a corner, that is also not necessarily trail braking. Trail braking is a planned, deliberate deceleration past the turn point. Front brake, both brakes, rear brake can be rolling off the throttle. Trail braking is deliberately decelerating or still scrubbing speed as we tip into the corner. Now we have to have a turn point to make that happen. A turn point requires an exit. This is another one of those myths that still revolves a lot around the motorcycling community and also in teaching. Apexing, talking about apex entry and exit, came from the racing world. You're on a dedicated environment. Everybody knows what's on the other side. If something goes wrong on the other side, there's somebody there waving a flag to tell you there's something to watch out for. On the street, we don't get that. The problem with picking an apex is you need to have all the other points first. Apexes are a byproduct of the exit and the entry. The exit is the only thing that matters to us, especially on the street. We do not commit to anything until we have an exit. Once you have an exit, you have a turn point. The closest point on the inside of that curve is your apex. That's a byproduct. What you do is you look behind you and you go, oh, that was a late apex curve. It's not something you look for before you go into the curve. You're only driving to the exit. Now to do that, we're going to use trail braking. What trail braking does is allows us to change not only the speed going into the corner, because this is a big thing, right? We go into corners because we feel like we're going too fast. Very few people run off the corners because they actually run out of ground clearance or traction. It's usually the rider who runs out of the wheel to make it through. We can also change the attitude of the motorcycle. Racers a lot of times will get the bike to pitch up on the front so it'll turn in quicker. I can change traction by changing loading on how much braking I'm doing, how much acceleration I have, and also I change stability because I preset my suspension so it's not doing things I don't want it to do before I go in the corner. By adding a little bit of brake and holding that, I settle the bike as it tips in. So what I'm doing is extending my braking zone from the entry of the corner all the way into the curve. So I do the most of my braking just like we do currently, but what I'm going to do is keep a couple fingers on that brake, and as I tip into the corner, I'm just going to continue to hold that brake. If the corner starts to tighten up, I slowly decrease speed. If a corner is getting too tight, there's only two ways you're going to make it through. One, you're going to lean more. For some of you, you ride bikes where that's not always an option. And the bigger issue is at some point, a lot of times our brains kick in and they tell us we shouldn't do that. We shouldn't lean anymore. The other way to tighten up a corner is to slow down. The slower I go, the tighter my radius goes for any given lean angle. So as I go into that corner and I'm dragging that brake in and I just increase the braking, as that corner tightens up, I just match my brakes to the distance I can see because I'm never riding faster than I can stop. That's what we do for trail braking on the street. And it makes sure that you will never, ever, ever, ever ride through a corner too fast again. And you can't be surprised if you do it properly. So it's a great technique for using on the street. It works, and this is one of the ways it works. Let me explain traction a little bit. When I look at this green circle, that is the value of traction that I have. That is not referring to the amount of rubber on the road. That's talking about the traction coefficient that is available to me. It's not a 1-for-1 ratio. If I have 100 points of traction and I use 50 for one, I don't have 50 left over. Turns out, because it's an area equation, I can have up to maybe 70%, roughly 70% maximum lean, and be on 70% braking at the same time. What happens when we apply brakes? What happens to the traction on the front? Increase or decrease? Increases, right? We know that from doing normal braking. So it turns out that threshold we were on is no longer a threshold. Because I'm loading the front end, I'm transferring weight to the front, I'm increasing the pounds per square inch, I actually have more traction available. What's happening on the back? Kind of exactly the opposite, right? So as I transfer forward, this is why trail braking is, racers are often front brake only, trail braking. Street riders, we use both. This is one of the reasons why rear trail braking is not a common method. it's the one that's the least manageable. And it has the least amount of feedback. These are very sensitive. They know what's going on. Your feet, especially through heavy boots, they don't have a whole lot of feedback. So this is why trail braking works. We're actually changing our traction. We're increasing traction as we go through those corners. To understand this, you have to know trail braking only works because we have suspension. When we talk about suspension, when I add throttle, what direction does the suspension move? Up or down? Up, absolutely. Man, you guys are really, let me ask that again because I just didn't hear a whole lot of agreement here. What direction does the suspension move on the front when we add throttle? Up or down? Up. Actually, so when we add throttle, what happens to the rear suspension? Up or down? Okay, so I'm going to tell you that's wrong and ask you again. Now, when I add throttle, what direction does the suspension go? Up or down? Up, exactly. Now, here's what a lot of us don't realize is when we understand the dynamics of the bike, we start going, oh, this is why we add throttle in the corner. I want maximum ground clearance and I want maximum traction. That only happens because the bike moves up. What is called anti-squat geometry. These bikes are all built so that when you add throttle, they don't squat. That wouldn't be to our benefit. When I add throttle, because of the axle point, the rear tire is trying to drive through the motorcycle. Everything's in its way. But because it's in the middle, it leverages the bike upward. That's why suspension has to be set correctly. That's why your sag has to be correct. The other thing that happens is the torque effect. Any of you older guys that have ridden some of the older generation shaft drives, you remember you roll on and that bike would jack up. That's a shaft jack. It's a drive chain lift. So you end up with this ability to drive forward to get that bike to stabilize into suspension, but also to give ground clearance. And if the tire is pushing the bike forward, what's happening to the tire pressure on the ground where it touches? It increases. Remember that little graph where we lost some traction on the rear? By keeping a little throttle on, it helps keep that pressure, and I don't have such a decrease. So I can manage my traction just by the brakes. And I do that by actually overlapping. This is called blending of controls. What I end up doing is as I come into the corner and I begin braking, I'm slowly starting to ease off the throttle behind my brakes. But I don't close the throttle all the way. When it's time for me to go, as I start to ease off the brake, the bike starts to accelerate because there's just a little bit of throttle behind it. And then I increase the throttle as I keep moving. I always keep tension in the drive line. This is one of the more technical ways, or the most technical way to do trail braking, because as I mentioned, there's a lot of different ways to do this. But this is one way to keep it in line. This 100% here does not mean 100% wide open throttle. It means 100% that I'm using at the entry. But as you see, I'll start decreasing the throttle, increasing the brake. As I turn in, then I just remove that. So again, I'm watching, I'm trailing in. I find my exit. Once that happens, I tip the bike in and immediately want to pick that throttle back up. Trail braking is usually only a few feet. It's just out right after that turn point. Also keep in mind that the turn point is only in reference to the exit point. If it's a 360-degree curve that goes all the way underneath and continues, you may go 270 degrees before you actually get a turn point. Trail braking is only from that turn point. That's the only time we're thinking. So if you're scrubbing speed all the way through, you're not braking in a curve, you're just making sure you're not going to run off. So this is another way to think about cornering in general, and I don't know if you've thought about how suspension works or how the brakes work or what's going on with the dynamics of the bike, but the more we understand, the safer we become as street riders. Our choices always turn into some sort of a consequence. Why do we keep making the same poor choices if we already know it's a bad choice? We know we're not supposed to look down in the corner. We know we shouldn't be chopping the throttle. We know we shouldn't tense up. And the reason is fear. Fear is what causes us to make all of those different mistakes. Once fear takes over and we lose the ability to control the motorcycle, we end up getting in trouble.